Okay, so we have our individual listing page completed, where visitors can view information and be redirected to an application URL from our job board. Now let's work on creating one of those listings. Generally, from what I've seen on job boards, this happens on a separate page that contains a form and basic checkout flow. You enter in the information for the listing, as well as payment information, and once the purchase has completed successfully, your post is either published or queued up. So that's what we'll be working on in this video. First, let's open up our routes web file and add in a new route for our form page. We'll make it new, and it'll be resolved by the listing controller's create method. And we'll call it listings.create. We'll also need to create a post route at this same location to process the form request. It'll be handled by the listing controller's store method and be called listings.store. Okay, let's head into our listing controller and create both of those new methods. Public function create and public function store request. For the create function, all we need to do is return a view, listings.create. And for the store function, this is where we're going to process the listing creation form, validate the input, make the purchase, and create the listing. Let's start with the form. In our listings directory, we'll make a new file called create.blade.php. Like with our last two views, we're going to use the XAppLayout component to extend off of, creating a wrapper, and adding in a heading with the page title, create a new listing, followed by the price, let's say $99. We can test this out now, but first I'm going to open up our header blade component and update this link's href attribute to point to the listings.create route that we just made. Okay, refreshing the browser, clicking on the Post Job button, and perfect, our view is returned as expected with the title that we just set. Let's continue on. First thing we should do is return any errors that might be present from our form submission. If errors any, and then in an unordered list element, let's loop through them and just echo them out. Alright, now we need to build the actual form element. Its action is our listings.store route. We'll give it an ID of payment form, a post method, and we'll need to specify the ENC type as multipart form data, since this form will contain a file input for the logo image. We'll also give it a light gray background and some slight padding. After that, the first inputs that we should show should be the user's information. But I only want to display these if the person submitting this form is not an authenticated user. If they are, we can attach the new listing to their already formed account. But if they're not signed in or a user at all, we want some information to create that account for them. Using this blade directive guest, we can wrap these inputs in it, and it'll only display this to users who are not authenticated. Let's add those in. Actually, instead of doing labels and inputs manually, I think I'm going to instead use some of the components that were added in when we installed Breeze. That way, this form should match the authentication forms directly, and we have less markup to write. For the label, we can use this xLabel component and pass in the ID of the input it's for. For this case, email is the first one. And for the value, that will display as the label text, so we'll set it as email address. Then under that, we'll use the xInput blade component with an ID of email, a type of email, a name of email, and a bound value of old email. The colon before the value attribute means that the blade component will process that value through PHP instead of taking it as a literal string. So the value will be set using the old Laravel helper method, which retrieves flash data over input from a redirect during the form submission process. Finishing this off, we'll add on the required and autofocus attributes as well. Okay, our first input is done. Let's copy this and paste it. And modify the next one for the user's name. Then let's create a new row and make an input for the password. As well as the password confirmation. Alright, let's see how that looks so far. Perfect, all of the fields that we need to create a new user if one is not authenticated. Let's continue on and add in the rest of the form markup we need to create a new listing. I've pasted all of these inputs in for the sake of time, but let's go through them. We have one for the job title, one for the company, a file input for the logo, another input for the location, a text area for the content section, and a checkbox input to let the user determine if they want their listing highlighted for an additional fee. And here's what that looks like so far in our browser. We're getting close to wrapping this up. Continuing on, we'll need a placeholder element for the Stripe front-end library, which we'll give an ID of card element to. And then the CSRF token input, helpfully generated by this blade directive, followed by a hidden input to store the payment method ID generated by Stripe and used to process the actual payment. And finally, a submit button to actually submit the form and start processing the information. If we refresh the page, we can see right now that we don't have any payment inputs being displayed. We just have the pay and continue button we added. So for our next step, let's get Stripe's payment library added in and the card element rendered so we can capture payment information. At the bottom of our view, let's add in the Stripe JavaScript library. js.stripe.com/v3. And then under that, a new script tag where we'll add in all of the vanilla JavaScript needed to power this page. First, initialize the Stripe library, passing in our public key from the env file. Then create an elements object with stripe.elements. And create the card element with elements.create, passing in the type of element, and an options object, which we'll leave blank for now. Then mount the element by using cardElement.mount and specifying the ID of the element we created earlier, cardElement. Now if we refresh our listing form, we can see that we now have a Stripe payment element at the bottom, where we can enter a credit card number, as well as the expiration, CVC, and zip code. Before we're able to process this form and create the listing on the back end, we have to verify that the card information the user entered in is correct and able to be used to purchase the listing. Stripe handles this validation, but we have to write a basic script to make that happen. First, we're going to get the form submit button element, and add an event listener to it. On click, we're going to call e.preventDefault, which will prevent the default behavior, submitting the form, from happening. Then we're going to call const and a destructured object consisting of a payment method or an error. That'll be the result of a call to await stripe.createPayment method, and we pass in the type set to card. Then the card element we created earlier, and an empty options object. We can determine if the card was valid by running a conditional on the error object. If there was an error, let's just alert it out to the user. Otherwise, get the payment method ID element, our hidden input, and make its value the payment method ID. Then get the form element, payment form, and submit it. So in summary, prevent the submission of the form when the button is first pressed, and then only if the card is OK, set the payment method ID and submit the form. One more thing before we continue. The form element that's generated by Stripe is a little small and plain, and blends into the background of the rest of the form. In that elements.create method earlier, we can pass in a classes object to the options, and specify a base attribute to apply a list of style classes to the payment element. Let's add in the default Stripe element class, followed by a few that make up the rest of our inputs in this form. Alright, let's save this and refresh. Perfect! The payment information element looks very close to the rest of our inputs and fits nicely in this form. Now that the front end looks done, we can turn our attention to processing the form. Back in our listing controller's store method, the first thing we'll want to do is validate the request coming through. Instead of calling request validate and passing in the array there, I'm going to build a separate array variable above it. The reason that I'm doing this is because I'll need to conditionally add items depending on if there's an authenticated user or not. To start, let's add in the fields we'll need to validate for our listing itself. The title is required, company is required, logo is just a file with a max size of 2048 kilobytes, location is required, apply link is required and needs to be a URL, content is required, and payment method ID is required. Next, let's determine if a user is authenticated. If they're not, we'll need to add more to this validation array. Email should be required, an email and unique to the user's table. Password is required, should match the confirmation, and have a min character count of 5. A name is required. Then we'll pass the whole array into the request validate method, which will handle validation and redirection depending on the values of the inputs coming in against the rules that we set above. Next, let's determine if a user is present with the authUser method. If there's not, we'll create one. User create, and pass in an array of items that we need to create that user. Name from request name, email from request email, and password, which we'll hash from the value of request password. Then we'll call createAsStripeCustomer on this new user object, which generates values in our Stripe application and database to associate this user model with the ability to have purchases saved to it. And finally, we'll authenticate the user directly. After that, let's process the payment and create the listing. I'm going to wrap all of this in a try block. First, we'll set the amount in cents, our list dollars, so that's 9,900 cents. But if the request coming in has a value for is highlighted, that means the user is paying extra for their listing to be highlighted. So we'll increase that amount by $19, or 1,900 cents. We'll then process the payment first by calling the charge method on our user object, which takes two arguments. The first is the payment amount in cents, and the second is the payment method ID generated from the Stripe JavaScript library on the front end. It's the ID that holds the card information. The credit card data itself is never passed from the front end to the back end. Once that completes, we can start working on our listing. Markdown is what will be coming in from the content input, so I'm just going to initialize the parsedown extra library that we installed previously to a variable called MD, and then create the listing, attaching it to our user model by calling the listings method on our user. And then the create method, followed by the array of data we need for the listing. Title from request title. Slug will be the value of the request title passed through the str slug helper, and followed by a random 4-digit number. Company from request company. Logo, the base file name of the request file logo. Stored in the public path. Location from request location. Apply link from request apply link. Content will be the parsed HTML coming from parsedownExtra's text method, passing in request content. Is highlighted is a boolean determined by what's returned with the request filled method on the is highlighted input. And is active, we'll hardcode as true for new listings. If all of that goes through well, we can set our attention on the tags. For each of them, we'll create an array by separating the value of the request tag's input by commas. We'll call tag first or create. This method takes two arrays as arguments. The first is the condition in which you'll look for a tag that does or doesn't exist. So, we want to find a tag that has a slug that would be the same as the slug from the tag coming in. If that exists, then a tag is returned right now. But if it doesn't, then the second argument is called, and that array is used to fill in the data for the model created. So we'll fill in the name as the uppercase value passed in. Once we have our tag, we can call the listings relationship method on it and attach, passing in our created listings ID. This sets the relationship between the tag we found or created and the listing that was just created. And finally, we return a redirect to the user's dashboard route that we saw earlier with the Breeze installation. If there's an exception caught with the code above, let's instead return a redirect back with errors and pass in the message from that exception. That should then display above the form in the errors box that we created. Alright, back in our browser, let's refresh and test this form out. Since I'm not an authenticated user, I'll have to add in some info to create that user model as well. Email address, name, password. Let's add in the job title, company name, logo, that should work, a location, a link to apply to the position, some tags, we'll go with PHP and JavaScript, that sounds appropriate, and then some basic content. I'll also want this post highlighted. And for the card information, since we're using Stripe in test mode, we can use the test card information. 42, repeating, followed by any expiration date in the future, and any CVC or zip code. Click Pay and Continue, and we're in the dashboard. which is a good sign. That means that my user was created and authenticated successfully, and the listing should have been created successfully as well. Heading to the index page, and there's my listing. First in line and highlighted, exactly what we expected. Clicking on it and clicking the apply link, we are redirected to the link that I set in the form. And if we go back to the Post a Job form, you can see that the user fields are no longer there. Because I'm an authenticated user, we don't have to fill those out. Let's try and create a second listing. A bit different tags and content. Pay and continue. And perfect. Just like our other one, this one is displaying just as expected on our front page. Let's see if our payments went through. Signing into my Stripe dashboard and looking at the account associated with this dashboard, I can see that 2 payments went through for the exact amount that I was expecting. After clicking on the payment, I can see that my user I created is the one who made those purchases. So now we've enabled people to purchase a listing on our job board and create an account for them in the process. Up next, we'll make a simple dashboard to help these users see what listings they have available and how well they're performing.